Hello, hello. Welcome to a short video where I'm going to go through the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the structure of DNA that happened in 1953 and perhaps was one of the most significant scientific and historical events in terms of what it has enabled us to do these days in the last century. Let's take a look at the players involved. All right, there are commonly four names that are given when we talk about the scientists who discovered the structure of DNA. The two people who usually get top billing is Watson and Crick, which are shown in the lower image with a molecular model of DNA. All right, James Watson is the one on the left-hand side, and Francis Crick is the guy on the right-hand side. We have Wilkins at the top here and Rosalind Franklin at the top right. Okay. Now, the structure of DNA was actually found, and I will put it out this way, it was found through a combination of scientists, okay? And there was some dodgy business involved. All right. Essentially, at the time, there was a rush from a bunch of different scientific groups a bunch of different groups of scientists around the world who were all rushing to try and work out the structure of DNA. Because what they had done at the time is that actually worked out that the nucleotides of DNA, they were important, whereas previously they thought the protein, the histones that DNA wraps around in the chromosomes, was what carried hereditary information. All right, they worked out that that wasn't true, and the race became on to work out what was going on with those nucleotides. Okay, now, as it happens, all right, when we talk about the model of DNA, I really want to get down to the language of what we actually mean when we say a scientific model. All right, now, what Watson and Crick did, okay, was they built a model. They built a, quite literally, from that prior slide, a physical representation, okay, but also a diagram, mental picture, and what eventually becomes, when you start actually doing computer modeling, mathematical statements and objects, 3D objects that can actually be modeled and so forth. All right, and I would like you to equate in your heads that a model is quite similar to a metaphor, but it's a metaphor used with a purpose to explain. Okay, so what actually happened in the discovery of DNA is that Watson and Crick, they built a model from the X-ray data, the X-ray refraction data that was carried out by Franklin on a crystal of DNA. Okay, essentially, X-rays, they're electromagnetic radiation. They behave like light, so they can be reflected, they can be refracted. And when something is refracted, it bends when it passes through objects of different density. All right, and X-rays are helpful because they have such a low wavelength. They will be refracted by structures at the atomic level. Okay, so if you can crystallize a molecular structure out as a solid, it's pretty straightforward to have an experimental setup where you can actually focus an array of X-rays through them and hopefully get some sort of idea of the structure. All right, what Franklin did was a revolutionary experiment at the time where she was actually essentially doing hundreds of hours of exposure of X-rays to crystallized DNA samples, and that enabled her and other scientists, because a bunch of people were working on it at the time, to actually put together structural information about DNA. All right, and of course, this model has since been built on, all right, by the further work of Watson and Crick, but also a bunch of other scientists who have gone on to discover the role that nucleotides have as the building blocks of genes and how that works in protein synthesis, okay, and all the nuts and bolts of how DNA actually works. All right, and that goes a long way towards establishing these ideas in biology, such as the central dogma of cells, where DNA codes for proteins, and DNA, the instructions of those genes in DNA undergo a process called transcription to form messenger RNA, which then leaves the nucleus and goes to the ribosomes in the cytoplasm of the cells and is used to assemble proteins from amino acids. Okay. I spoke more on that in our last video. All right. So talking in detail about the discovery of DNA, I mentioned there was some dodgy business. So let's get into that because it's really quite interesting what happened. Okay. Now, people knew something existed, something physical existed that carried the information that was passed on from parent to child. Okay, Mendel, one of the scientists, or actually a monk at the time. All right, but a lot of early science was actually carried out in monasteries. All right, this was kind of before science was science. He worked out that there were pairs of hereditary information. He called them factors. And of course, Darwin, who established ideas of evolution and natural selection, he posited that there would be a discovery of something that explains some physical thing that explains how traits are passed on. All right, from the early 1900s, DNA was our suspect. Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins, they worked in the X-ray lab that took the famous pictures of the DNA that was used by James Watson and Francis Crick to actually establish a model, the first model of the structure of DNA. All right, and at the time, there were other competing models. There were single spiral, triple spiral models. All right, it was one of Franklin's images that actually provided the clue for the final clue to actually help Watson and Crick develop their model. Now, in all about this saying this, okay, the breakthrough was using the image shown just on the bottom left, just here, the characteristic X shape. All right, which is literally a blown up image of the coil of DNA that is 2 nanometers across, 2 times 10 to the minus 9 meters across. Rosalind Franklin took that image. She discovered the structure. Crick, Watson, Wilkins. They worked with her data to build a model. Okay, chiefly Crick and Watson. But this is kind of where it's really dodgy. Crick, Watson, and Wilkins got the Nobel Prize for working out the structure of DNA. All right. Franklin kind of got screwed over and didn't get the credit that she deserved. And it gets worse than that. Alrighty. So, generally a Nobel Peace Prize, okay, which there's a bunch of different things that you can be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for. All right, science is one of them. All right, and it is a prize that was established by Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite. Okay, and not only is it quite prestigious, but it is also has a $1 million grant associated with it as well. All right, plus if you have a Nobel Prize as a scientist, you basically have an easy time getting additional grants to pay for more of your work and study that's happening if you're working in academic research. So there's a lot of benefit to someone having a Nobel Peace Prize. Okay. Now, basically, Crick, Watson, Wilkins, they were awarded the Peace Prize. Rosalind Franklin was not. All right. Now, the rules for awarding a Nobel Peace Prize is it's only awarded to a living person. Okay. Unfortunately, at the time of the prize being awarded, Rosalind Franklin had died. And the unfortunate truth of that is that they just didn't quite understand the safety of the X-rays and the other nuclear materials that scientists in her field worked with at the time. And the experiments involved tens of hours of exposure to X-rays to resolve those small, very small molecules as images that are viewable. All right. But it gets worse than that. Okay. When Rosalind Franklin actually went to work at that lab, Wilkins treated her as an assistant rather than as a colleague who in equal standing to him, that's just crappy. All right. It gets worse. Wilkins took Franklin's work without her permission. They took her famous image of the structure of DNA and shared it with Watson and Crick. Yeah. So they were given someone else's work without permission, and that enabled them to get, fame and fortune and recognition for the discovery of DNA. That's really crappy. All right. Still, it gets worse. All right. James Watson has he's still alive to this day, has over the last 50 years essentially been really blatant about his character assassination of Rosalind Franklin. Okay, you can see some of the excerpts put it together in books that were written by James Watson, as well as from interviews given, and it's really just crappy. All right. In fact, there's a recent TED talk which I will share with the class. All right, because it's very interesting. It's actually of James Watson talking about how they discovered DNA. And the one thing I'll point out, he's probably mellowed a lot with age, but he's still sore about the criticism he has been on the receiving end. And he questions Rosalind Franklin's credentials. This is a lady who has been dead for 50 years. He questions her credentials like she's a threat to his claim. That's just shitty behavior. Okay. All right, and it's not cool. So, in terms of speaking about that, Rosalind Franklin is kind of a perfect example of how hard historically it has been for women to be accepted in scientific and other professional communities. It is something that has changed dramatically in recent times, but it still is something that we are working towards being better with in all fields in the world. Okay, and it's absolutely important to call out and, not put people like James Watson, the surviving member of the pair who were given credit for Franklin's discovery, to actually put them on a pedestal and worship them as a hero when they did a shitty thing. Okay, yes, they made an important discovery, but they did so at the cost of someone else's discovery and have carried out character assassination of that person after they had died for decades afterwards. So, that being said, what I will finish with, just as we start to wrap this video up, is a little challenge for you. Can you name other women who have made important discoveries in science? And let's make this hard. Can't name Rosalind Franklin. You can't name Madame Curie. Okay? And I will give a commendation to the first 10 students who name a female scientist who has made an important discovery. Okay? And what that discovery is in the comments in our Google Classroom. All right? Go find someone who is doing something great. All right? And finally, just to finish us off, it is my absolute pleasure and the pleasure of a lot of science teachers, scientists, and other people who are enthusiasts about biology and science in general, and scientific discoveries, that Rosalind Franklin is now getting the recognition that she deserved, that the truth of the situation is getting realized. And thank you for watching the video. And let's get on with the class. Bye-bye.